George Washington. Let's start at the very beginning. The man whose face is on the dollar bill, whose name is on a state, a monument, and about 400 streets across this country. But here's what gets lost in all of that marble and mythology. George Washington was losing. For most of the Revolutionary War, he was getting beaten. His army was underfunded, undersupplied, and outnumbered by the most powerful military force on the planet at the time. His men were starving at Valley Forge. Officers were deserting. The whole thing looked like it was going to collapse. And Washington held it together anyway. Not because he was the best battlefield general in history, he wasn't, but because he understood something that very few leaders ever grasp. That war is not just about winning battles, it's about surviving long enough for your enemy to lose patience. He survived. Britain lost patience. And then, and this is the part that gets overlooked, when it was all over, when he had won, when his soldiers and supporters were practically begging him to become king, Washington said no. He walked away, he went home to Mount Vernon. That moment, a general choosing to give back power voluntarily, was so rare, so genuinely unprecedented, that King George III of England reportedly said that if Washington truly did that, he would be the greatest man who ever lived. He did it. And then he did it again. 2 terms as president, and then he stepped down again. He handed power to the next person and walked away. That tradition he set, that a leader's greatest act is knowing when to leave, became the backbone of American democracy. It held for over a century and a half. One man, one decision, centuries of consequence. Thomas Jefferson, 5 words changed the world. All men are created equal. Jefferson wrote those words at 33 years old in a rented room in Philadelphia. He wasn't just writing a political document. He was writing a promise, a statement so radical that kings across the globe recognized it as a direct threat to everything they stood for. Now, we have to say this. Thomas Jefferson owned enslaved people, hundreds of them. He wrote about the immorality of slavery and did almost nothing to stop it. That contradiction is not a footnote. It is a central, unresolved tension in his legacy and in the story of America itself. But here is what history forces us to hold at the same time. The words he wrote outlived his contradictions. Frederick Douglass, who we'll talk about shortly, used Jefferson's own words to dismantle the institution of slavery that Jefferson himself refused to dismantle. The Declaration of Independence became the most powerful argument against everything Jefferson failed to do. That is the complicated, genuine story of Thomas Jefferson. Benjamin Franklin. If Washington was the sword of the Revolution and Jefferson was its voice, Franklin was its charm. He was 70 years old when the Revolution began, already one of the most famous men in the Western world, inventor, scientist, writer, diplomat. And then he got on a boat and went to Paris. Because here's what most people miss. America could not have won the Revolutionary War alone. It needed a powerful ally to keep Britain stretched thin. France was that ally, and Benjamin Franklin was the reason France said yes. He walked into the most sophisticated court in Europe wearing a simple American fur hat. No powdered wig, no silk coat, just a plain colonial hat. Paris went absolutely crazy for him. He parlayed that celebrity into one of the most consequential diplomatic relationships in world history. French money, French troops, and French naval power helped turn the tide of the war. Benjamin Franklin didn't fire a single shot, and he may have done more to win the war than almost anyone who did. James Madison. Washington was the first president. Jefferson wrote the Declaration. Franklin charmed the world. But who actually designed the government? That was James Madison. He showed up to the Constitutional Convention more prepared than anyone else in the room. He had spent months studying every republic, every democracy, every attempt at self-governance in recorded history, looking for what worked and what failed. Checks and balances, separation of powers, a federal structure balancing national authority with state rights. These weren't abstract ideas. They were Madison's precise solutions to problems he had identified in every government that came before. And when states were reluctant to ratify the Constitution, Madison sat down with Hamilton and Jay and wrote 85 essays, the Federalist Papers, explaining exactly why this system would work. Those essays are still used by the Supreme Court today. James Madison is the reason the United States has a government that has lasted, with amendments and evolutions, for nearly 250 years. Alexander Hamilton, born in the Caribbean, orphaned young, arrived in New York with almost nothing, and through sheer intellectual force became one of the most important figures in American history. After serving as Washington's most trusted aide during the war, Hamilton became the first Secretary of the Treasury and looked at a broke, indebted nation with no functioning financial system and built one. He created the National Bank. He established the credit system. He understood something crucial, that a nation's power in the modern world would rest on its economic strength, Not just its land, not just its army, its economy. He was right. The financial architecture he designed became the foundation on which American economic power was eventually built. He died in a duel at 49, shot by a sitting vice president, and even in death, he left behind more than most people accomplish in a full lifetime. Right here, before we continue, I want to tell you about something that goes deeper than any video can. Lives that built America, from the founding to the moon, 1776, 2026 goes further than this video ever could. 250 years. Founders, freedom fighters, presidents, pioneers, and the men and women who carried America all the way to the moon. Every chapter is a life. Every life is a turning point. If today's video made you feel something, that book will make you feel everything. We'll come back to it at the end. Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery, separated from his mother as an infant, a deliberate cruelty designed to prevent any sense of family or belonging. He taught himself to read, in secret, against the law, and reading cracked something open in him that could never be closed again. He escaped at 20 years old and spent the rest of his life making sure the entire country understood what slavery actually was, not as an abstract political debate, but as a lived human reality of violence, theft, and dehumanization. His autobiography became one of the most widely read books in America. He advised Abraham Lincoln personally. He fought with words that cut like weapons for decades. And here is the most powerful thing about Frederick Douglass. He used America's own language against it. He took Jefferson's words, "All men are created equal," and held them up like a mirror to a country that had refused to look at itself. He didn't reject America. He demanded that America become what it had promised to be. That is a harder thing, and he did it his entire life. Harriet Tubman. If Douglass was the voice, Tubman was the action. She escaped slavery in 1849 and made it north to freedom. And then, instead of staying safe, she went back 13 times. She returned into slave territory under constant threat of capture or death and brought roughly 70 people out through the Underground Railroad. She never lost a single person. During the Civil War, she served the Union as a scout and spy. In 1863, she led a gunboat raid that freed over 700 enslaved people, one of the largest liberation operations of the entire war. Harriet Tubman was 5 feet tall. She had suffered a severe head injury as a child that caused her to lose consciousness without warning for the rest of her life. Martin Luther King Jr. 100 years after Douglass and Tubman, the fight they started was still not finished. Legal slavery had ended, but a system of legal discrimination, enforced by law, by violence, by the full weight of state power, had taken its place. Martin Luther King Jr. refused to accept it. What made King remarkable was not just what he believed. Millions believed in equality. What made him remarkable was how he fought for it. Nonviolent, direct action. The disciplined choice to absorb violence without returning it. Because he understood the watching world would see who the violent ones were. It was a moral strategy. And it worked. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. Legal segregation dismantled. He was 39 years old when he was assassinated. The arc of the moral universe, he said, is long, but it bends toward justice. He spent his whole life bending it. Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt became president at 42, the youngest ever, and immediately started doing things. He went after the railroad, oil, and steel monopolies, giant corporations that operated essentially above the law. He broke them up. He used the government as a tool to protect ordinary citizens from concentrated corporate power. And then he turned his attention to the land. He looked at the American wilderness and saw something most of his contemporaries didn't. Something finite. Something that could be destroyed. He protected it. 230 million acres of public land. National parks, national forests, wildlife refuges. That's a gift still giving, more than a century later. John Adams, the most underrated founder. The man who deserves more credit than he usually gets. Adams stood up first. In 1776, when independence was still a radical idea, he argued for it with everything he had. Jefferson was the better writer. Franklin was the better diplomat. Washington was the better soldier. Adams was the truest believer. He spent years in Europe as a diplomat, separated from his family, negotiating the international relationships needed. He helped secure the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the Revolutionary War. As president, he kept the United States out of a war with France that most of his party wanted to fight. He believed the young country couldn't survive it. He was probably right. He was voted out for it anyway. On his deathbed, July 4th, 1826, his last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He didn't know Jefferson had died just hours earlier. The same day, the same anniversary, History sometimes writes itself. 10 people, 2.5 centuries, one ongoing, unfinished, extraordinary experiment in self-governance. The story of America is not a simple story. It is not a story of perfect people making perfect decisions. It is a story of deeply flawed human beings attempting something that had never fully been done before. Building a country on ideas rather than bloodlines, on principles rather than the will of kings. Some fell short of those principles catastrophically. Some spent their lives forcing the country closer to them. All of them were real. All of them were human. And all of them made choices that you and I live inside of right now. That is what history actually is. Not dates, not monuments, lives. Before you go, if this kind of storytelling is what you've been looking for, there's a book you need to know about. Lives That Built America goes further than any video can. Scan the QR code on screen right now to find it on Amazon. If this video moves something in you, share it. Leave a comment about which story hit you hardest, and subscribe, because we are just getting started. See you in the next one.